I was born in the United States, but I spent many years living in Hong Kong. My business in Asia was successful, and over time, I became wealthy. After 20 years away, I finally decided it was time to return home to New York. It wasn't just a simple trip back. I had been gone so long that I felt like a visitor to my own country. On my way to New York, I made a stop in California. I had an old friend in San Francisco, someone I hadn't seen in years, and I wanted to visit him. His name was Mohan Dampier, and we had been close for a long time. We used to write letters often, but lately I hadn't heard from him. I wasn't sure if he had moved away or if something had happened, but I wanted to see him again. Dampier was different from most people I knew. He had never worked a day in his life. His father gave him just enough money to live on, so he never had to. Instead of building a career, he spent his time reading, but not just any books. His interest was in the occult, mystical, and supernatural subjects. He truly believed that luck, magic, and unseen forces shaped his life. I never took those things seriously, but Dampier lived by them. As soon as I arrived in San Francisco, I sent a message to his house, letting him know I was in town for 3 days and asking if I could visit. To my surprise, his response came quickly. Instead of a simple reply, he sent a servant to my hotel with a note that read, "Come to my house at once, my dear friend. Come this evening, you'll remember the house, I'm sure." It was my father's home. I live in the tower at one end of the house. You don't have to ring the bell or knock. I've told the servants to go to bed, and I'll leave the front door open for you. Come straight up the stairs, I'll be waiting. Please come soon. There was something odd about the message. It felt urgent, almost desperate. But I was curious, and after so many years apart, I wanted to see him. That evening, as the storm rolled in, I took a cab to his house. The wind was strong, and cold rain poured from the sky. I had forgotten that winters in California weren't always warm and sunny. As we approached his home, I saw it a dark 2-story brick building with a tower at one end. The house sat near the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by a garden that must have been beautiful in spring, but was now lifeless in the winter rain. When the cab stopped, I stepped out and instantly felt soaked. The rain was relentless. I hurried toward the tower's entrance and reached for the handle. Just as he had promised, the door was unlocked. Dampier's house, when I arrived, looked just as strange and mysterious as I remembered. The strong wind whipped around me as I stepped out of the cab and quickly ran toward the tower. The rain was coming down hard, soaking me in seconds. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of wet, chilling rain that I had completely forgotten about. Living in Hong Kong for so long, I had become accustomed to warm weather, so I wasn't prepared for the cold of California's winter. The house itself was a 2-story brick structure that looked as though it had been standing for many decades. At one end of the building, there was the tower, which was where Dampier had lived for years. The garden surrounding the house, which I imagined would have been quite beautiful in the spring, now seemed almost lifeless. It was winter, and the trees were bare, their branches reaching up into the dark sky. Flowers were absent, and the once lush plants were now just shadows of their former selves. I could barely make out the details in the stormy darkness, but the tower's entrance was only a few yards away. I pushed open the door without hesitation, just as Dampier had told me to. The door creaked as it opened, and I stepped inside. Inside the tower, everything was dim. A single small lamp lit the stairway, casting long shadows on the walls. It was hard to see clearly, and the dark, musty air felt heavy around me. I cautiously climbed the stairs, running my fingers along the wall as I went, trying to steady myself in the silence. At the top of the stairs, there was another door, which I opened without knocking. As I entered, I saw Dampier waiting for me. His appearance shocked me. He had once been a handsome man, but now he looked pale and frail. His hair was graying, and there were deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Dampier seemed like an entirely different person. He was thin, and even though he wasn't more than 50, he looked much older. He greeted me with a weak smile, offering his hand. His clothes were strange, an old-fashioned long coat and soft leather slippers. His eyes, though, still had that familiar brightness, even though they seemed distant. Dampier invited me to sit down, and we exchanged pleasantries. He poured me a drink and offered a cigar, but there was an unsettling tension in the air. After all, it had been years since we had last spoken, and it was clear that our reunion wasn't as joyful as I had hoped. We spoke for a while, but our conversation was awkward and filled with silences. I couldn't help but notice that Dampier didn't seem entirely present, as though something was weighing on his mind. I could sense his unease, and it made me feel uncomfortable as we sat in the dimly lit room, trying to catch up after so many years. An eerie silence settled over us. The conversation felt strained, and I could tell that Dampier wasn't fully himself. He seemed distracted, his eyes occasionally flickering toward the dark corners of the room, as though waiting for something or someone to appear. I tried to keep the conversation light, offering polite remarks and comments about old times, but it was clear that Dampier wasn't interested in small talk. He seemed lost in thought, his mind elsewhere. It wasn't long before the silence became unbearable. Outside, the storm had quieted, but the stillness inside the room felt oppressive. I couldn't shake the sense that something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Just as I was considering leaving, trying to excuse myself from this uncomfortable meeting, something strange happened. A sound broke the quiet, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from one of the walls. The noise was not loud, but it was clear. It wasn't the sound of someone knocking at a door or the wind tapping against the windows. It was methodical, almost like someone was trying to send a signal. I turned to Dampier, expecting him to explain the noise, but he was staring at the wall, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. He didn't seem to hear the tapping at first, but as I looked at him, I noticed his expression change. It was as though he recognized the sound, like it was something that had happened before. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to escape the strange tension in the room, but I didn't want to seem rude or leave my old friend in his time of need. Dampier, however, didn't seem to notice my unease. He was completely focused on the wall, his gaze fixed on it, as if trying to decipher something hidden within the sound. "Please stay," he said suddenly, his voice tense. "There's no problem. Nobody is there." I hesitated but decided to remain. Dampier's strange insistence made me feel uneasy, but I didn't want to let him down. He walked over to a small window, opened it, and gestured for me to look outside. I crossed the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. But when I looked out into the rain-soaked street, there was nothing unusual, just the faint glow of a street lamp and the heavy rain falling steadily to the ground. No one was out there. No one was standing near the wall, yet the tapping continued, faint but persistent. Dampier, his face pale, turned to me. "I must tell you something," he said. "I'm the only one who can tell you this story. Will you listen?" I felt a chill run down my spine, but despite the growing discomfort in the air, I agreed. I didn't want to leave just yet. Something about Dampier's demeanor made me want to hear him out, even though I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple reunion between old friends. Dampier took a deep breath, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if he would continue. His expression had darkened, and his eyes looked almost haunted. I could tell that whatever he was about to say had been weighing on him for a long time. He slowly poured himself another drink and offered me another cigar, though I had no real interest in either. I felt a chill in the air, despite the warmth of the room, and I instinctively crossed my arms over my chest. "It's a long story," Dampier began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "But I feel like you're the only one who will understand. You see, I didn't move into this house until my father passed away. It was 10 years ago when I was about 40 years old. Before that, I lived in an apartment building on Rincon Hill in San Francisco." I nodded, trying to mask the unease creeping through me. Dampier had always been a bit eccentric, but this was different. The way he was speaking, the seriousness in his tone made me feel like I was about to hear something that would change everything. "I was living on Rincon Hill before my father's death," Dampier continued. "It was a nice place back then, before the area became run down. The building wasn't the best, but it was cheap. The walls were thin, and you could almost hear everything that went on in the rooms next to yours. I was lucky I had a large room and I spent most of my time reading. I didn't need much else. I could picture it, the dim, narrow hallways, the creaky old building, and Dampier, hunched over his strange books, so absorbed in his studies that the world around him hardly seemed to matter. "It was a warm day in June," Dampier said, his voice distant now, as if he was reliving the memory. "I was leaving my apartment when I saw her for the first time. She was standing outside, wearing a white dress and a straw hat with flowers and ribbons tied around the brim. She had the most striking face I had ever seen. There was something strange about her beauty, something that pulled me in." He paused, his face softening as he looked down into his glass. I could see the way his fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of the cup. "I couldn't help myself," he continued, his voice almost a whisper. "I tipped my hat and bowed, but she didn't speak. She just looked at me with these shining brown eyes. I knew she was intrigued, but she didn't smile. And then, just like that, she went inside the building and shut the door behind her." Dampier's eyes narrowed as he stared into the distance, the memory clearly consuming him. I couldn't stop thinking about her. The next day, I waited by the window, hoping to see her again. I did, but when I went out to follow her, she disappeared. It was as though she had vanished into thin air, but I kept looking for her. I couldn't get her out of my mind. His voice trailed off, and the room grew even quieter. I could feel the weight of his story pressing on me, and I knew the strange events he was describing were only the beginning. As Dampier continued, his tone grew more intense, and I could see that the story was beginning to take a darker turn. His gaze remained fixed on the floor as though reliving each detail in his mind. I wasn't sure whether to interrupt, but I knew he needed to get it out. He needed to tell his story, no matter how strange or unsettling it was. "I couldn't stop thinking about her," Dampier said quietly. The next day, I waited by the window again, hoping to see her. I watched the street for hours, but she didn't appear. I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then the next morning, there she was again. She came out of the building just like before, in the same white dress and straw hat. I knew then that it wasn't a coincidence. I listened, captivated by his words. It felt as if he was telling me something much more than just a story about a chance encounter. There was an underlying sense of urgency, a quiet desperation in his voice. He wasn't just telling me about a girl he had seen, he was telling me about something that had been haunting him for a long time. Dampier took another drink before continuing. I didn't follow her, not directly. But I would go out whenever she did, just hoping to see her again. And finally I did. We smiled at each other, but we didn't speak. She just went about her day, and I followed her from a distance, walking through the neighborhood. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, wondering where this was all leading. Dampier seemed to be lost in the memory. His eyes glazed over as though he were seeing it all play out again in front of him. After a while, I decided to ask the landlady about her, he said, his voice low. I wanted to know who she was, what her name was. So I asked the landlady one day, "Who's the girl with the white dress and the straw hat?" He paused, his face twisting with discomfort. The landlady told me she was her niece, a servant who worked in the building. She lived on the top floor next to my room. The revelation hit me like a cold wave. Dampier's tone had shifted. He was no longer just recounting a chance meeting. He was describing an obsession, a growing fixation that had begun to consume him. "I wish I'd never heard that," Dampier muttered. The girl's room was next to mine, separated only by a thin wall. I would lie awake at night, thinking about her, wondering if she was sleeping on the other side. It drove me mad. I could feel the tension in the room rise, as if the very air had thickened with Dampier's growing obsession. His voice trembled as he went on, describing the nights he spent tapping on the wall, sending signals he hoped she would understand. But despite all his efforts, the girl never replied. She was always just out of reach, like a dream he could never quite touch. The guilt in his voice was palpable, and I could tell that whatever happened next had scarred him deeply. As Dampier's story unfolded, the atmosphere in the room became heavier, almost suffocating. His words were slow, deliberate, and it seemed like he was forcing himself to relive each painful detail. It was clear now that what had started as a simple infatuation had spiraled into something much darker, something beyond his control. I could see it in his eyes, the guilt, the torment, the realization that his actions might have set something in motion that he couldn't undo. I didn't reply to her signals anymore, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I had stopped waiting for her. I put my mind back into my studies, thinking that I could forget about her, about the strange connection between us. But then one night, everything changed. Dampier paused, and I could feel my heart racing. There was something in his voice now, a sense of dread that was hard to ignore. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard it. The tapping, it was soft at first, almost like a whisper against the wall. Tap, 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 tap. His voice dropped to a whisper as he mimicked the sound, his face twisted with anxiety. I couldn't believe it. The girl wasn't responding to me anymore, and yet I heard it. I heard the tapping. I shivered involuntarily, unsure if I wanted to hear more. Dampier's voice had taken on an almost frantic edge, and I could see the way his hands clenched around his glass. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But no, it was real, and I couldn't stop myself. I tapped back. 3 times. Tap, 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 tap. He paused again, his face pale, his eyes wide. That was the first time. I wasn't sure what to make of his words, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dampier continued, his words now coming faster, as though he was afraid he might lose his nerve. For days I listened, but there was nothing. No reply. Then, a week later, the tapping came again. Soft, persistent. Tap, 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 tap. He mimicked it once more, his voice becoming more urgent. I knew then. I knew that something was wrong. The girl had never responded to my signals, and yet she was reaching out again. But this time, I didn't reply. I could feel a cold chill crawl up my spine as I listened, my mind racing to understand what Dampier was saying. After that, I heard nothing. Days went by and I never heard the tapping again. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. I knew something terrible had happened, and it was only a matter of time before I would find out what. He took another long drink, his eyes fixed on the floor. The next morning I heard the news. The landlady came to me, her face full of grief. The girl, my neighbor, was dead. She had fallen ill, and despite all efforts, she passed away in the night. They said she had requested her bed be moved next to the wall, the very wall that separated our rooms. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as Dampier's voice grew lower. That was the second time the tapping had come, and then I heard about my father's death and everything changed. I left my apartment and moved into this house. It's been my home ever since. I've been waiting, hoping to understand what happened, hoping for a sign. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and resignation. Necromantius, he wrote about the fatal triad. 3 signs, 3 occurrences, and then death. I've heard the tapping twice, and now you've heard it too. The air in the room felt thick and oppressive, and I could sense the weight of what Dampier had just shared. The tapping. The signs, it was as if everything had led to this moment. What does it mean? I asked, barely above a whisper. Dampier stood up, his face pale, his eyes haunted. You must decide. Has the fatal triad been completed? Dampier's voice lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of his words. He stared at me with those strange, bright eyes, almost as if he were waiting for me to confirm something he had been afraid to acknowledge for years. I sat there, unsure of what to say, but I knew that his story, whether real or the product of his own tortured mind, was something that would stay with me forever. The room felt cold now, despite the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. The storm outside had stopped, but the air still carried an eerie sense of anticipation, as though something was about to happen. Something that had been set in motion long ago, and could no longer be undone. Dampier's face, pale and drawn, reflected the same uncertainty that I felt deep in my chest. I never expected you to come, Dampier said quietly, breaking the silence. "But your visit, it wasn't a surprise. I had been waiting for it, in a way. That's the strange thing about this fatal triad. You can't escape it. The signs are always there, waiting, but you don't know when they'll happen." He smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've accepted something painful, even inevitable. It was as if he had reconciled with the idea that the tapping, the strange, unsettling sound that had haunted him for years was a signal, a warning. A warning that something tragic was bound to happen. I stood up, feeling the weight of his story pressing on me. The room was too small now, the air too thick. I had heard Dampier's tale, and although I couldn't fully grasp the supernatural elements of it, I couldn't deny the unease it stirred in me. Maybe it wasn't the tapping, the mysterious girl, or the old occult books that had caused his downfall. Maybe it was his obsession, his inability to let go of something that didn't truly exist. Perhaps the real tragedy lay in his mind, in the way he allowed himself to be consumed by an idea, by a belief that had no basis in reality. As I walked toward the door, I turned to Dampier one last time. "I'll leave now," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "But I hope you find peace. You've carried this burden long enough." Dampier didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes distant as though lost in thought. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of regret in his gaze, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Stepping out into the cold night, I was struck by a realization. Sometimes, we create our own ghosts. We cling to the past, to old beliefs and fears, and let them control our lives. Dampier's story was a warning, not just about supernatural forces, but about the dangers of obsession, of letting ourselves be ruled by something we can't fully understand. We all have our own fatal triads moments when we're given a chance to break free from our past, but we often don't take it. And in the end, it's not the external forces that haunt us, but the ones we create in our minds. The lesson was clear. Don't let your fears and regrets define you. Let them go before they consume you entirely. As I walked away from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dampier's ghost would remain trapped in that tower, forever waiting for a sign that would never come.